Have you ever felt like you're your own worst enemy? Like no matter how much you achieve, there's a little voice in your head whispering, "You're not good enough." Or maybe you second-guess yourself so much that you never take action, stuck in a loop of overthinking. If that sounds familiar, you might be caught in the ego trap, a psychological battle between confidence and insecurity that keeps you stuck. And believe it or not, this struggle isn't just some modern-day anxiety problem. Two of the greatest minds in psychology, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, spent their lives studying why we feel this way and how to break free from it. So in this video, we're diving deep into the ego trap, how it shapes your self-doubt and insecurity, and most importantly, how to escape it. Let's start with a story. Let's dive deeper into this invisible psychological battle, because whether you realize it or not, it's happening inside your mind every single day. The best way to understand the ego trap is to picture your mind as a constant tug-of-war between three powerful forces: your desires, your morals, your identity. Sigmund Freud was one of the first to map out this internal struggle, breaking the mind into three key parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id, your inner rebel. The id is the oldest part of your mind, the wild, impulsive side that just wants pleasure, comfort, and instant gratification. It's the voice that says, "Eat that whole pizza. Sleep in. Forget about your responsibilities. Say whatever's on your mind. Who cares what anyone thinks?" The id doesn't care about consequences or long-term goals. Its only job is to make you feel good right now. And while that might sound reckless, the id isn't the villain. It's actually vital to your survival. Without it, you wouldn't have any drive to pursue what makes you happy or fight for what you want. But if the id runs the show, life becomes chaotic. That's where the next player comes in. The superego, your inner critic. If the id is your inner rebel, the superego is your inner parent. It's the voice that says, "You should really be more productive. People will judge you if you mess this up. What will others think if you fail?" The superego is shaped by your upbringing, society, religion, and cultural norms. It's the part of you that wants to be perfect, always doing the right thing, always seeking approval, always avoiding shame. On the surface, the superego seems like a positive influence. After all, it helps you stay disciplined and considerate. But here's where things get tricky. The superego doesn't just guide you, it judges you. It holds up an impossible standard of who you should be and constantly reminds you of how you're falling short. That's why so many people struggle with self-doubt, because the superego's voice is loud, critical, and never satisfied. The ego, the middleman. Caught between these two extremes is the ego, the part of you that's trying to keep everything balanced. The ego's job is to navigate between the id's desires and the superego's rules, making decisions that serve both your needs and your morals. For example, your id says, "Quit your job and become a full-time artist." Your superego says, "That's irresponsible, stick to the safe path." Your ego says, "Maybe I can work on my art on weekends while keeping my job." The ego is the voice of reason, but here's the catch. The more pressure the ego feels to meet expectations, whether from society, family, or even yourself, the more it starts playing it safe. It becomes obsessed with how others see you. It tries to control your image, and slowly, without even realizing it, you start shaping your whole life around what you think will earn you approval, not what actually makes you feel alive. That's the ego trap, the invisible prison. What makes this trap so dangerous is that most people don't even realize they're in it. At first, it feels like you're just being responsible, hardworking, or considerate. But underneath, there's a constant hum of anxiety. What if I'm not good enough? What if people judge me? What if I disappoint everyone? Every decision starts coming from fear rather than freedom. The irony is that the harder your ego works to protect your self-image, the more fragile that self-image becomes. You end up walking through life on eggshells, afraid to take risks, afraid to fail, afraid to show who you really are. Carl Jung described this perfectly with the idea of the persona, the mask we wear to fit into society. Your persona is like a social media profile in real life, carefully curated to show only the best parts of you. The problem is, the more attached you become to this mask, the more disconnected you become from your true self. And the scariest part? Most people would rather cling to the mask, even if it makes them miserable, than risk showing who they really are. Why does this happen? It all comes down to one basic human fear: rejection. Deep down, we're wired to seek connection and belonging. And the ego believes that the best way to protect us is to fit in, by meeting expectations, avoiding failure, and hiding any flaws that might get us rejected. But here's the paradox. The more you try to please everyone, the more disconnected you feel from yourself. The more you hide your flaws, the more insecure you become. The harder you chase validation, the emptier you feel when you get it. Why does this matter for you? Once you see this dynamic playing out inside yourself, it changes everything. Suddenly, self-doubt doesn't feel like a personal failure. It feels like a pattern that's been running your whole life without your permission. That voice in your head telling you you're not good enough? It's not the truth. It's just your superego trying to keep you safe. That fear of what people might think if you fail? It's not reality. It's your ego trying to protect your image. And once you recognize that, you can finally start breaking free. In the next section, we'll explore where this self-doubt really comes from and how to stop letting it control your life. But before we go there, let me ask you something. What's one part of yourself that you've been hiding from the world? Would you still be afraid to show it? If you knew that's where your power really lives? The key takeaway is that self-doubt isn't a flaw. It's a symptom of the ego trap. Now, let's pause here for a moment. You might be asking yourself, if I'm not my ego, then who am I really? That's where we go next. So now that we understand the ego trap, let's talk about how it leads to self-doubt and insecurity. Because if you've ever felt like you're not good enough, like an imposter in your own life, or like you're constantly seeking approval, you're not alone. In fact, these feelings don't just happen randomly. They come from deep psychological patterns that have been shaping your mind for years. Let's break this down, step by step. 1. The ego becomes addicted to external validation. Think about the first time you ever felt proud of yourself. Maybe it was when you got a good grade, won an award, or made someone you admired happy. Now think about the first time you felt ashamed. Maybe you were criticized, embarrassed, or told you weren't good enough. Both of these moments had something in common. They taught you that your worth depends on how other people see you. As kids, we learn pretty quickly that certain behaviors get us love and praise, while others get us judgment or rejection. And because we all want to be accepted, our ego starts building a strategy for survival. Do what gets approval. Avoid what gets disapproval. At first, this seems harmless, but over time, it turns into something much bigger. Instead of making choices based on what feels right, we start making choices based on what looks right. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" we ask, "What will make people respect me?" And before we know it, our self-worth becomes tied to external validation, meaning we only feel good about ourselves when we get approval from others. 2. Fear of judgment creates the false self. Once the ego gets hooked on external validation, something strange happens. We start creating a false self, a version of ourselves designed to be accepted, admired, and respected. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to fit into society. Think of the way you act in different situations. At work, you might be the responsible professional. Around friends, you might be the funny, easygoing one. On social media, you might be the confident, successful version of yourself. None of these versions are fake. They're just fragments of who you really are. But here's the problem. The more we rely on the false self, the more we disconnect from our real self. And the more disconnected we become, the more insecure we feel. Because deep down, we know that people aren't really seeing us. They're just seeing the mask. This is why so many successful people still feel like imposters. No matter how much they achieve, they're haunted by the thought, what if people find out I'm not really who they think I am? That's imposter syndrome, one of the clearest signs that the ego trap is in control. 3. The superego turns self-doubt into self-sabotage. At this point, something even more dangerous happens. The superego, which is supposed to guide us, turns into a relentless inner critic. It starts saying things like, "You should be better by now. You're not as smart, talented as other people. If you fail, everyone will see you're a fraud." And because the ego is so focused on protecting our self-image, we do whatever it takes to avoid failure or embarrassment. That's when self-doubt turns into self-sabotage. Here's how it works. Fear of failure. Self-sabotaging response. Procrastination. Because if you never try, you never fail. Fear of judgment. Self-sabotaging response. Perfectionism. Because if it's flawless, no one can criticize. Fear of rejection. Self-sabotaging response. People-pleasing. Because if everyone likes you, you're safe. And just like that, we get stuck. Not because we're lazy, untalented, or unworthy, but because the ego is too afraid to take risks. This is why some of the most talented people in the world never reach their full potential. The artist who never shares their work. The entrepreneur who overthinks every decision. The writer who never finishes their book. It's not that they're not capable, it's that their ego is holding them hostage. 4. The shadow self, where our insecurities hide. Carl Jung believed that everything we reject about ourselves gets pushed into the shadow self, the part of us that holds all of our fears, insecurities, and suppressed emotions. And the more we deny these parts of ourselves, the stronger they become. For example, if you were taught that anger is bad, you might repress it, only for it to come out in passive-aggressive ways. If you grew up believing you had to be perfect, you might suppress your failures, only to become terrified of taking risks. If you were criticized for being sensitive, you might harden yourself, only to feel disconnected from your emotions. What we don't face controls us from the shadows. This is why people who seem the most confident on the outside are often the most insecure on the inside. Because the more we try to suppress our weaknesses, the more power they have over us. Why does this matter for you? At this point, you might be thinking, okay, I see how self-doubt and insecurity work, but how do I break free? Here's the truth. The only way out is through. You can't escape insecurity by chasing more success, more approval, or more validation. You escape by turning inward, by learning to face, understand, and integrate the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. And in the next section, we'll talk about exactly how to do that. But before we move on, let me ask you this. What's one insecurity you've been running from? What would happen if, instead of hiding from it, you faced it head on? Think about that for a moment, because that's where your real power begins. So how to escape the ego trap? By now, you see how the ego trap works. It keeps you addicted to external validation. It makes you afraid of failure and judgment. It turns self-doubt into self-sabotage. But here's the good news. You are not your ego. And once you realize that, you can start taking back control. The question is, how? How do you break free from the fear, self-doubt, and insecurity that have been running your life for so long? The answer isn't to fight the ego or destroy it. It's to understand it, work with it, and transcend it. Let's break this process into 4 powerful steps. Step 1. Separate yourself from your ego. You are not your thoughts. The biggest mistake people make is thinking their ego is their true self. But here's something most people don't realize. Your thoughts are not facts. The voice in your head that says, "I'm not good enough. I'll never succeed. People will judge me." That's just your ego trying to protect you from failure and rejection. But just because the ego says something doesn't mean it's true. Here's a simple exercise to break free from your thoughts. The next time you hear that critical voice in your head, pause. Instead of believing it, say, "That's interesting. Who's talking right now? My ego or my true self?" Imagine stepping back and observing your thoughts like a scientist studying an experiment. When you do this, something powerful happens. Instead of being your thoughts, you become the observer of your thoughts. And when you stop identifying with your ego, you take away its power. Step 2. Face your shadow. The parts of yourself you've been hiding. Carl Jung believed that true self-acceptance comes from integrating your shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected or suppressed. For example, ask yourself, what do I secretly feel ashamed of? What traits in others trigger me the most? They might be a reflection of my shadow. What emotions do I avoid feeling? The things you fear the most are often the keys to your freedom. Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That means the insecurities you avoid will keep controlling you until you bring them into the light. So instead of running from them, face them. Here's how. Write a shadow letter, a letter to the parts of yourself you've rejected. What would you say to them if you were trying to understand them rather than judge them? Talk to your younger self. What did they need to hear when they were struggling with self-doubt? Tell them those words now. Practice radical honesty. The next time you feel insecure, say, this is my shadow talking. What is it trying to teach me? When you start accepting your imperfections instead of hiding them, something incredible happens. You stop fearing judgment because you're no longer hiding from yourself. Step 3. Redefine success on your own terms. One of the biggest reasons we stay trapped in insecurity is because we're chasing someone else's definition of success. Think about it. Society says success is about money, status, and recognition. Your ego wants to fit in, so it chases those things, even if they don't make you happy. But what if success wasn't about external validation? What if it was about inner peace? Take a moment and ask yourself, what does success actually look like for me? Not what society says, what I truly want. If I had no fear of judgment, what would I do differently in my life? If I stopped chasing approval, what kind of person would I become? When you redefine success on your own terms, your ego loses its power over you. Because now, you're not seeking validation, you're seeking authenticity. Step 4. Take imperfect action. Let go of perfectionism. Here's a secret your ego doesn't want you to know. You don't have to feel ready to take action. Most people wait until they feel confident before they start doing the things they want to do. But that's backward. Confidence doesn't come before action. It comes because of action. Think about it. You don't become a good writer by waiting to feel like a writer. You become one by writing. You don't become a confident speaker by overthinking. You become one by speaking. You don't overcome self-doubt by waiting. You overcome it by taking action despite the doubt. So if you've been holding yourself back because you don't feel good enough yet, stop waiting. Take imperfect action today. Post the video. Apply for the job. Start the project. Share your work. Not because you feel ready, but because you refuse to let fear run your life anymore. True confidence comes from letting go. Here's the irony of the ego trap. The more you try to prove yourself, the more insecure you feel. But the moment you stop trying to prove anything, the moment you let go of the need for validation, you become truly free. Because confidence isn't about knowing you'll succeed. Confidence is about being okay, even if you fail. So the next time you feel self-doubt creeping in, ask yourself, what would I do right now if I wasn't afraid of failure? What's the worst that could happen if I stopped trying to impress people and just focused on being myself? If I had nothing to prove, how would I live my life? The answer to those questions will tell you exactly where your freedom lies. And once you step into that freedom, once you stop living for your ego and start living for yourself, everything changes. At the end of the day, the ego trap is an illusion. Self-doubt and insecurity aren't proof that you're unworthy. They're just signs that you're human. Both Freud and Jung agreed on one thing. True freedom comes from self-awareness. The moment you stop letting fear control you, you take your power back. So if you've been stuck in self-doubt, Remember this: you don't need permission to be yourself. You don't need to prove your worth. You're already enough. Now go take action. The world is waiting for you. If this video helped you, let me know in the comments. What's one fear you're ready to let go of? And if you want more deep dives into psychology, philosophy, and self-growth, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next video. See you next time.